How does the new NIH Review Framework that was just released, how does this affect you as an applicant of NIH grants? It's a good question, and it is that season again when NIH is mixing things up. And many of us as applicants might ask, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? How is this going to affect me? Do I have to do something differently? Because over the years, NIH is in the habit of mixing things up every few years and changing criteria. Sometimes it's big changes. I remember back in the 2000s when we changed from the 25-page format where there was often a long background and significance and there was a long section on your prior work, and they condensed it down to 12 pages. Suddenly everything changed. Well, this is not that dramatic of a change. So that's good news. And I think there's other good news in here. But before I get into the specifics of the good news, I just want to talk a few details of what those changes are. Now, I have on the screen here this simplified peer review framework showing from the NIH website. I'm not going to go through the whole document here. You can do that in your own time. I'll post the link in the video, below the video here for anybody who wants to go read this and do your own research. And by the way, these changes aren't taking place until January 25th, 2025. So you got some time before this happens, but it's good to be prepared because they're getting at some things that I've been teaching for years, and the new changes actually align even more with what I've been teaching. And so if you follow what I've been teaching for many, many years, you're actually going to be ready for this, and you're going to be more ready for the current review format as well. So I think it's good news. And let's talk about specifically what the changes are. So the changes really are going from 5 factors. So the current 5 factors are the significance, innovation, investigators, environment, and approach, not necessarily in that order, but those were the 5, and each one of those in the current system is being given a numerical score. That numerical score goes from 1 through 9 with, for some reason, somebody a long time ago in like the 1950s or something decided that 1 would be best and 9 would be worst. I don't know why. I'm sure there's a history to that. But in any case, 1 is best, 9 is worst. And so typically, those scores are all given independently. And then on a study section, a discussion ensues. And from that discussion, it is expected that they will come up with an impact score, an overall impact score that really measures how much importance does this work have, how much impact does this work have in the field at this time. And that's again on a 1 to 9 score. And it's that final impact score that decides what happens with the grant proposal, how it will be percentiled. And your percentile in many cases determines whether you will actually get paid, you and your institution, or not paid for that grant. So those are the current factors. Now this is changing by focusing in on just 3 factors now. 3, no longer 5 independent factors, and only 2 of these 3 factors will actually be scored. So let's talk about that last thing that I said, because that's the biggest change. It's really this big change in factor 3, this expertise and resources, which includes investigator and environment. So these things that were previously separated out and given separate scores are now just part of expertise and resources. And this is to be evaluated. Let me zoom that out a little bit. This is to be evaluated as either sufficient or not. It's either or. It's not a score. Now, this is part of the really good news, I think. It's good news, especially if you're not already a well-established lab with a track record of funding at a well-known institution. Because how can we as humans help but have some bias that if your proposal is coming in from a very big name university and you've had a track record of years of funding, to say, yeah, you're probably more set up in terms of the environment to actually do the work than maybe somebody who's at a small institution and doesn't have a track record, right? It's hard not to have some bias. That doesn't mean that people at a small institution without a track record can't contribute something substantial and impactful to the research community. Often they can, very much so. But in terms of these two things that used to be scored, or still are for the time being until this change goes into effect, the investigator and environment, in other words, higher numerical numbers on these typically than somebody at that brand name institution. So here they've said, NIH is making this explicit choice. We don't want there to be like a competition here for who has resources. It's like a binary. Either it's enough or it's not enough. Either you think that they can probably carry out the work or not. Now, there is a subtle factor here of, maybe people who are better resourced could carry out the work more expediently. But I'm sure based on internal discussions at the NIH, they decided that it's more important to give people a chance who may not have the resources to be quite as expedient or quite as fast, but they might have a different angle on it that may in the end have more impact than just more faster research being cranked out by just big name labs. So I really think that this is good for the lesser known people especially. If you're already a well-known lab cranking things out, you already have so many advantages in this system that this kind of takes away one small advantage that you have, but you still have lots of advantages. So don't worry about that if you're in that situation. Now, the other changes are factor one is the importance of the research, and that's really blending together the significance and the innovation of the research. And factor two is the rigor and the feasibility. And that is all about the approach. It used to be called, or is presently called, until the change goes into effect, the approach section. And again, scored 1 to 9, scored 1 to 9. So it'll really boil down to these two scores, plus the sort of binary of the factor 3, to ultimately draw from that the decision of the impact score. So there will still be the traditional discussion that happens that ultimately decides from these two factors plus the binary factor 3, how will this impact the scientific field and the community and the world and all of that? And that will be that 1 to 9 score. This is a change, and it's an interesting change because it really aligns with something that I have taught for many years, the most important things. So let me give you a brief background and then I'll explain exactly what those things are. I, for many years, have been known to be around the interwebs talking about this idea that it's actually the reviewer emotion that matters. It's not some kind of factual, rational decision that they make. And you may say, but wait, this is supposed to be objective and unemotional. How can you say that this is an emotional process? Well, we are humans and we value certain things. And whenever we value something, we have an emotion associated with that thing. If we were all flat, emotionless beings, then yeah, we could just replace ourselves with AI. There's plenty of, AI out there like ChatGPT and all of that, many different variants of that kind of thing happening now. It's like real. I can't believe it actually, but it's pretty cool. But it still doesn't have any emotion. It doesn't value things in the way humans do. And you might say, well, that's a bad thing. That's messed up. But it's actually, I argue, a good thing. Like we value quality science, right? We value rigor. We value impact. We're not saying it must be impactful because nobody cares and nobody has any emotion or feeling about that. It's exactly because we care that things like impact and rigor are important. It's because we have an emotion about those things that those things are important. So if you buy my premise that the emotion is actually important, then the next sort of step you have to take mentally with me is this idea that reviewers are all going to have some kind of emotion when they are reading your proposal. And that is either an emotion of like, I'm uninterested, I'm bored, I'm stressed out, or I don't have time to read this, or I don't trust these people that they can actually do this work. It seems kind of spotty or sketchy. Those are all emotions, right? So what are the emotions that we want reviewers to have? Well, there's a whole long list that I've sometimes talked about at seminars and workshops, but we can boil that list down. And this is where this framework comes in. So we have the two here on the screen. And I actually learned this years ago from somebody that I took a marketing seminar from, who said, everything in marketing is desire and trust. And I was like, whoa, wait a second. That same thing applies to grant proposals just as well. Yet I'd never seen nor heard of anybody talking about this in grant proposal land. And I've been now talking about it for over a decade because it's so important for you to understand when you're submitting a proposal that in the end, these two emotions are going to determine the fate of your proposal. Do they desire it? So I'm specifically linking this now. I think the new NIH policy really highlights the importance of desire because they're talking about factor one here. Let me try to not cross it out. Factor one, the importance of the research, the perceived importance. How do you judge importance? Well, you judge importance based upon what you value, what you think is important, and then things that you think important, you will value more, you will desire more, and things that you don't think are important, that are unimportant, it's sort of like you're bored by or you're uninterested. So desire is just a catch-all phrase that actually relates to a number of emotions like enthusiasm, excitement, interest, curiosity. All of those fall under the broad category of desire. And this importance of the research, really, they're saying there are two parts to this. There is the significance, which we've talked about in the past, and the innovation. And I, again, for many years have said, significance, this is all about creating your desire. And so is the innovation. You can go back in my grant writing courses and see me talking about that again and again. And now the NIH is just making it more explicit. They're really saying there are two parts to this equation here, only two parts. And this is one, the factor one, the importance of the research. How important is it to you as a reviewer? How important do you judge it to be for the field? Which it's very hard for any human, again, to step outside of their personal perspective and really say, this is important for the whole field, because everybody will have a different opinion about that. That's why we have multiple reviewers. So we get multiple people saying, do they desire this or not on this sort of 1 to 9 scale, labeled as the importance of the research. So again, the desire goes back to that enthusiasm. Is it exciting? Do they think it's going to make a difference, have an impact, all of that kind of stuff? That's the desire component. And this one is actually the one that I find most of the people I work with, this is much harder to create for people than the trust part. I mean, the trust part's not easy by any means, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to say, more of the people that I work with really struggle with creating this desire. They are biased too much towards creating the trust and don't do enough to create the desire. And I'll give you the number one hint, because that's not really the point of this video. It's to introduce these changes. But I'll give you the number one hint for creating desire is always give your reviewers reason why. Why this thing you're proposing is going to have an impact, why it's important, why. And not just a single layer of why, but layers. It's like from a famous movie where it's like, I have layers, like onions? Anyway, okay, I just don't know if I'm supposed to mention the movie name here on YouTube. Maybe I can mention the movie name and not get in trouble. But anyway, you want layers. And that is one of the biggest things about creating desire. And that's why I teach, the idea of telling a story, because a story is really about layering your whys. But I get into that in other places and other times. So that's the desire part. The trust part, which is rigor and feasibility. Rigor and feasibility. If you think about it, do I trust you that, okay, yeah, it seems like you're going to have an impact, but do I trust that you can actually carry out the research, make it happen, be effective, and actually do research that's going to be lasting, not just be published and then, have a retraction 2 years later, right? I mean, all of that stuff speaks to the trust factor. Do we trust? And they call it rigor and feasibility. They're dividing this into the approach section. So just the sort of overall scientific quality. And again, that's a pretty subjective thing. Now, there's kind of a general consensus amongst broader scientific community about what that means, but it's still just a consensus. Nobody has a perfectly logical argument that I know of for what scientific quality actually is in the real world. And there's a lot of debate about that, right? So different people have different takes on that, and that ultimately boils down to, do I think this is a quality thing? Is this money invested going to yield something that has this ephemeral quality of quality? I was just thinking about the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is all about this idea of quality. So if you want a deep philosophical treatise on quality, you can check that book out. But, yeah, that's a loaded term, quality. Especially once you read that book, you're like, wow, yeah, this person had some issues trying to figure out what that really means. Okay, I don't want to give away the whole story in case you haven't read that book. Okay, rigor, just unbiased. So this is a little bit more objective, but there's still always going to be a subjective component to this. Is it unbiased, reproducible, and robust? And, if you look at the statistical community, there are always plenty of arguments about what actually constitutes rigorous, unbiased, reproducible, and how much is enough. Because, I think in the limit of infinite sample size, you could have truly unbiased and reproducible, robust data. I don't think there's any argument about that in that limit of infinite sample size. But in the real world of messy research and limited budgets and limited people who have different diseases or whatever, then it becomes a much more messy thing of when is enough for unbiased, when is enough for reproducible, when is enough for robust. And it's those arguments, again, that lead back to this emotion of like, do I ultimately, as a reviewer, you have to make a judgment. Do I trust these people that they can do as good a job as possible given the limitations with these sort of constraints of rigor? And also experimental design. Again, what's a good experimental design and a poor one? Well, in some of the grant writing classes we do, like Grant Foundry, we talk a lot about this. We've talked more and more about it over the years. I used to think it was just about the writing and helping people with the writing, but I realized actually over the years watching students who sometimes struggled that often writing problems are really experimental design problems. So we spend a lot more time thinking about that and trying to make that better. But again, there's never just one right answer. There's always going to be this component. So it really is, do you come across as trustworthy, as having a good design that is not likely to fail on the first go round? Or if something unexpected happens, is it robust in the sense of, that you can change course and still get something useful out of this? But then there's the final point of feasibility. So there's this old saying that goes around that, you have to do a half to 2/3 of the research before you even apply to do the research that you just did half or 2/3 of. I never liked that approach. I mean, I know some people in the real world use that approach. I didn't like it for two reasons. One is I felt like it stifled creativity and innovation. And number two, I felt it was like pretty boring, honestly. And number three, I didn't think it was necessary. And I proved with my track record of getting grants funded that it wasn't necessary, because I never did that amount of work on a proposal before I submitted the proposal. I mean, in many cases, it was just a month or two of really focused effort to get specific preliminary data that was needed. And, maybe we had a past sort of related track record of stuff, but for this specific proposal, usually a month or two 3 at most of specific data generation to show this is feasible, and that was enough. But nonetheless, people want to know, wherever you fall on that there's some feasibility here, that you can show that if you try this, it's not just going to fall apart at the first moment. And again, all of these speak to trust. Do they trust you that if you get this money, you are going to do something worthwhile with it versus just fritter it away, because this money is a precious resource. I mean, there's a lot of it that comes through NIH, but still, it's a precious resource. It's a very competitive resource. And so if you don't trust that somebody's going to use it well, who's going to support them for funding? I wouldn't, certainly. So I want the trust and I want the desire that it's actually going to have an impact. So these two things then work together. Now, and I love that the NIH has now really sort of made this even more explicit. They haven't come out and said desire and trust explicitly, but that's what they're clearly going for in this new sort of way that they've laid this out. I think that simplifies things. As a writer, I can now know I'm really going for the desire and the trust, and specifically thinking about those two things in my work. How am I addressing the desire and how am I addressing the trust? And when it was a list of 5 different things, that was much harder to think about. What am I doing here? Is this creating trust? Is this creating desire or not? Now it's simplified with this new framework. So I think that's a great thing. Also, they do say an application does not need to be strong in all categories to be judged likely to have a major scientific impact. And this is something that I've seen true time and time again working with clients, even in the present scoring system with the 5 different scores, that there are often applications that they may have a very strong desire component, not so much on the trust, but that high desire level, that high potential sort of impact or importance in the field, that is enough to overwhelm a somewhat lack of trust. I mean, if it's total lack of trust, it's never enough. But if you have like mediocre trust, but very high desire, sometimes that's enough to win out. And likewise, sometimes if you have mediocre desire, I would never say low desire, but mediocre desire and very high trust factor, again, that's enough to win the day. And that's essentially what they're saying in this quote, that it doesn't have to be strong in all of these categories, but you really have to think, this is the sort of, if I were to write it as a single equation, harking back to my physics days, that single equation might be, that you have to have a minimum of like 0.5 on either desire or trust. And the one that is, lowest of those, the other one has to be at a like 0.9 or something, and it's like the average needs to be 0.7. That's not a very good equation, probably 0.8. But anyway, that's not a very good equation, but hopefully you get my point, that you're like, okay, I'm really going for the trust here. So if I'm going to go all out on the trust, I still have to pay attention to creating that desire and really maximizing the trust, right? And that you really think about it that way, as opposed to just going into it blindly, as many of us do. I mean, I get it. I was there early in my career. I submitted a lot of rejected proposals. I had no idea what I was doing. And it's only after then switching everything and learning how to do it better, much better from a mentor of mine, and then teaching others how to do it better, that really these nuances and distinctions came into play. You have the benefit of that experience now because you've listened to this video. So that's awesome, right? So I think that the new scheme is overall less biased towards established investigators, and it's also more clear. I think it's more clear as to what you have to do to be successful, to create those emotions in your reviewers that lead to that enthusiastic response of both desiring your research and trusting your research. Now, I'll just finish this off by saying there are no gimmicks here. Sometimes people say, oh, you teach grant writing, so you're teaching gimmicks. And maybe in the early days when I was doing this, I thought of it as like, do good marketing and you'll win out. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a good product, in other words, a good project that you're proposing that's solid and rigorous, that creates that trust, It doesn't matter any amount of fancy writing, that won't make a difference. I mean, unless you actually do sort of things related to misconduct. And let's not go there. I hope you're not doing that. But if you are being honest and truthful in what you're proposing, then it needs to be a very solid project. But the project, not just creating that trust, creating that desire. And then the writing that tells the nice story of that solid project. That is how I encourage anybody to succeed regularly at your grant proposals. And if you want more help with that, visit us at grantfoundry.com. And we're happy to talk to you about your grant writing challenges, your grant writing aspirations, and what you're trying to achieve and how we might be able to help you more with that. This is Dr. Morgan Giddings signing off. I'll see you soon.